If you're not tough enough, you cannot be in the killing business. And I'm not just talking about being able to physically withstand all the punishment and taxation, which is an unavoidable side effect of the lifestyle the assassins lead. They're constantly jumping off of immensely tall buildings, for example, performing an obviously impossible parkour move like the leap of faith, which would at the very least fracture most people's spine and at most kill them. They're also getting into fights where they go 1 versus 10 or more multiple times and often have very minimal R&R time between missions. And how can you forget all the traveling on horsebacks, injuries, fatigue and loneliness, which brings us to the mental exhaustion, because we have to consider the extreme mental fortitude a person would have to possess to be able to do the things the assassins do and come out on the other side with their sanity intact. Think about it, they have killed hundreds if not thousands of people in some of the most brutal ways, might I add. Often dozens of children, decimated families, crippled empires, and have been the cause of sorrow for countless people. And even though most of them deserved it, that doesn't take away from the effects causing that kind of carnage would have on a person's psyche. Plus there's also personal tragedy, which almost all of these assassins have faced, and to a degree which would crumble most to bits and pieces. So it goes without saying that these assassins are some of the toughest sons of bitches to have ever walked the earth, or daughters of bitches in some cases. And even amongst these men and women with an unholy measure of resiliency, there are some who are just an inch away from superhuman levels of toughness. So who is the toughest? And I think it would be wrong to call those a bit low on the list as the weakest, because they're still more rugged than 99% of the people. So let's just say who's the least tough. Once again, I'd have to exclude Cassandra and Ivor. You know, despite many people saying that any list made without them are incomplete, in my humble opinion, including them is downright unfair for the humans on the list. So there's gonna be no God versus man here today. Now on to the list. On the last spot, we see Evie Frye. Now before anybody says I put her last because she's a woman, let me tell you that could not be further from the truth. She's last because she's the least tough in the list. As simple as that. Proofs in the pudding. Because if you've played Syndicate, you'd know that she faced no real tragedy. She was a good fighter, I agree, but never had an opportunity that forced her to face impossible odds. Plus, Jacob and Henry always had her back, and despite her being one of the toughest women in Assassin's Creed, on this list she most certainly fails to be any higher. And on the 8th spot, it's Arno Dorian. As far as being tough goes, he really doesn't even come close to the middle of the list. Arno, in spite of all his skills, lineage and gifts, was kept from achieving absolute greatness and the peak of his abilities because of love. Usually, love is not a weakness, but in Arno's case, it most certainly was. He could have been the deadliest and the most dangerous assassin to have ever donned the robes, but instead, he's made out to be weak, an almost pitiful man who, in his quest to impress Elise, lost sight of all that was actually important. And even though the man has faced his fair share of misfortunes like losing his father, his adopted father, and the love of his life, the one constant reaction we see Arno give to all the tragedy is him ignoring all his responsibilities and drowning himself in self-pity and seeking revenge. Even a small misunderstanding with his girlfriend and the man disappears and just intoxicates himself to a point where he's almost comatose, despite the city that he grew up in crumbling right under his nose. And that in my book ain't tough. On number 7 sits Evie's twin brother Jacob. Now I was gonna put them both on the last spot, mostly because they had a much better life than the other assassins. They were never broken to bits, never suffered terrible losses. To be honest, they lived good lives. But Jacob is a street brawler, and the man, if nothing else, is tough as nails physically, and he even enjoys the idea of throwing down hands and has the street fighter mentality. I really wish the story showed the Fryes being tested more mentally, because then we'd have a gauge as to how resilient they really are. But in Jacob's case, he has one merit. He survived Jack the Ripper, who despite taking an eye wasn't able to kill him. So yeah, the man's pretty rough and tough. There's no two ways about it. And the 7th spot suits him well. Next up, number 6, Edward Kenway. Now many of you might be shocked to see Captain Kenway this low, but the man, despite literally being a pirate, was never able to master his emotions the way many others on the list did. But was he a force to be reckoned with physically? He sure was. And even though he wasn't most tenacious, later in his life, after losing almost everyone the man held dear, he rose up and finally accepted his destiny. But I feel one particular incident really shoved him down the list: his death. He was killed by a handful of mercenaries, and it's not like he was too old to defend himself. The man was in his early 40s, which could be considered the peak for many of the assassins. That's literally a black mark on the otherwise terrifying man. In his heyday, the man has fought dozens, killed thousands, and was one of the most feared men in all of Caribbean. His final moments really undid all of that in my humble opinion. He was tough, but wasn't so for too long. And now we move to the next spot, but from here on out, it's super tough to place these hooded murderers. And almost all of the rankings could go in anyone's favor, depending on whom you might ask, and they would all be right under certain circumstances. But here's my top 5. On the 5th spot, we see Connor Kenway. Kenway. Listen, if we talk physically, the man was a beast, a force of nature. His sheer presence would send chills down most people's spine, and his durability is something that just cannot be questioned. The reason Connor's just above his grandpa and not third or fourth is because of his weakness in certain moments of his life. Most notably, his lack of commitment when it came to killing his own father, which at the time was arguably one of the most important things that absolutely had to be done. I understand that taking the life of one's own father must be incredibly hard, but the hardest choices require the toughest wills. And here's where Connor falters, in unshakable grit. So small yet substantial moments like this put Connor on number 5. Next up, it's Ezio Auditore on number 4. Now some might argue that he was the toughest assassin to have ever lived. I say he was one of the toughest, but not number 1, not by a long shot. Despite having faced unspeakable tragedy in his early days, as and when time went on, Ezio found his circle and was part of a brotherhood that supported and defended him on every step of the way. He was always surrounded by noble and virtuous men and women like Niccolo Machiavelli, Uncle Mario, Paola, Yusuf Tazim, and more. Because of which, despite facing insurmountable odds, he was never tested the way others on this list were. And with that being said, Ezio is a man that was insanely resilient. He was the most durable fighter and a freerunner in his 60s. His 60s, damn it. Plus, he had multiple encounters with the apple and yet did not collapse mentally, because we see what the artifact is capable of doing to weaker minds. So he most certainly was a man of determination and absolute will. And even though it's number 4, for me personally, Ezio will always be number 1. And now number 3, Bayek of Siwa. The son of Egypt was tested in a way few men ever have been. His son was killed right in front of him, and after avenging his only son, he had a choice: go back to his wife and mourn, or sacrifice all that he had and fight for something greater. Now I'm willing to bet 99.99% people would have chosen the former but not Bayek, because every fiber of his being was dedicated to the betterment of humanity, and he gave up the only person he had left in his life to help the world. Now that is some superhero shit right there. How many people can make that choice? How many have the determination and virtue to do something like that? Well, you know the answer. And as far as physical durability goes, we all know that ancient Egypt had some of the most horrifying terrain and natural habitat known to man. So surviving there would have been impossible for most. And Bayek used to regularly roam these lands all alone, and yet he survived for years. I mean, who knows? If Bayek ever got a sequel, he really might end up on the first spot. But as of now, third spot suits the Egyptian well. Next up on the second spot, we see Shay Cormac. This man, despite all his flaws, despite his betrayal of the creed, despite the fact that he became a Templar later in his life, is a shining example of willpower and mental fortitude. First, let's talk about this man's physicality. He survived earthquakes, has been shot and left for dead, but still he didn't die. Has killed some of the top assassins of his time, and he also has managed to live for a really long time. His toughness just cannot be matched. In his pursuit of justice and saving innocence, he gave up everything he ever loved and held dear. Everything. And not just that, the way he gave it up is what really puts him this high on the list. Imagine being in Shay's place, where you're faced with a choice: kill everyone you love to save thousands, or just walk away. Most men and women don't have the iron needed to make the first choice, but Shay did. And he was tough enough to walk the path and still live a full life and not crumble emotionally. This man is just a different breed. And now for the toughest, most determined man in the history of Assassin's Creed, Altair Ibn La Ahad. Do you know what it takes to walk the same path throughout your whole life? Do you know what it takes to stay true to a cause for a lifetime? It takes unshakable will and toughness. Toughness to resist the desire to sway. Toughness to keep walking despite the world crumbling around you. Willpower to not give up, no matter the losses and heartache. And Altair possessed all of that and more. First, let's talk about his body, which is capable of living to a long and unusual for its time age of 92 years old. Now that is incredible, especially considering his extremely physically demanding lifestyle, the treacherous nature of his era, plus the fact that he must be number 1 on the hit list of most of the Templar big daddies. And now for the most impressive part, his mental and psychological strength. The man had multiple encounters with the apple of Eden, and as I said before, lesser men would just crumble. But oh, not Altair. Not only was he able to resist its effects, the man took the apple under his control and learned from it, invented some of the most significant devices which helped the assassins for centuries. And despite being betrayed by his own brothers and sisters and being cast out like a dog multiple times, the man got back on his feet every single time. Even in his death, he did something that furthered his cause. It really stuns me when I think about the strength it would require a man to sit alone in a dark room and just wait until he dies. It really brings tears to my eyes when I think about all that Altair has done for the creed. His sacrifices are unrivaled, and his actions prove that he was the toughest toughest man to have ever donned the robes with a hood and will forever be an exemplar of what an assassin should be. And with that, we reach the end of the video, guys. Tell me down in the comment section below who you think is the toughest assassin to have ever walked God's green earth. And if you like the video and like my analysis, don't forget to pierce the hidden blade to the like button. Subscribe to the channel without fail. Support a brother from the creed. It's free, it's easy, so just hit that subscribe. So that's it for today, guys. Stay safe, stay strong, and stay tuned. It's your boy VZX signing out.